My name is Amy Robertson. I am a Family and Consumer Sciences Extension Educator with the University of Idaho here in Boundary County. Today we are going to be learning about canning poultry and other meats. So to get started, I have already cut up our poultry into small chunks, an inch or so, and they can be a little bit bigger, a little bit larger. It doesn't have to be exact, but you don't want huge chunks because you want to make sure that they get fully processed when you are canning them. Before I add our poultry to our jar, I am going to put in some salt. I use canning or pickling salt. You don't want to use other types of salt because that could cause cloudiness in your jar and you wouldn't be able to tell if it was caused by the salt or if it's because something else went wrong with your product. I'm using salt just for taste. In this case, you don't need salt for safety, so you can either use it or omit it. I'm using a half a teaspoon of salt in my pint jar. If I was doing a quart, I would add 1 teaspoon. Before we get stuffing our jars, I want to remind you that anytime you're canning, you want to make sure you're using proper headspace, or your jar might not seal, or product could come out of your jar and make a really big mess in your canner. So today I'm using a canning funnel that already has the headspace on the side, so that makes it nice and easy for me. So when you are adding your chicken to your jar, or other meats, you could do a method just like this with red meats, such as beef, lamb, or I've also canned quite a bit of wild game, such as deer or elk, all using this method. And this method is known as raw pack, because you are just cutting up your meat, you're not cooking it beforehand. The nice thing I really like about raw pack is that while your meat is processing in the canner, then it produces its own juices and you don't need to add any liquid later on. So as you can see, as I'm putting it in here, I'm kind of shoving it down pretty good. If you have a little bit larger hands, you might need to remove the funnel just to make sure that you're getting your meat in there. And you feel it pretty good because it is going to produce juices and kind of fill up that extra space. And when I look down here, I can see I'm right at about 1 inch of headspace, which is just perfect. So I'm going to remove my gloves so I'm not cross-contaminating anything. My lids have been washed because they are the newer version of the lids from Kerr and Ball. They no longer need to be simmered as they did in the past. They've changed that rubber compound a little bit. So as long as you check your manufacturer's instructions and look on your box of lids, usually now they're just going to tell you that you wash them and set them aside till you need them. And I almost forgot that we need to wipe down the top. So I am going to grab a wet paper towel to do that. And the reason you want to wipe down the top of your jar is because if you got any salt or meat, or if you were canning something else, you just don't want to have any food on the top of your jar because that could cause an issue with the seal. And because I did use this lid, I'm going to set it aside and use a different lid just in case there was something on that first one. And then you want to grab your ring or your band, and you can call it either one. Those words are just generally interchangeable. And you twist it and put it on, and you want it to be, about, they call it fingertip tight. So tight enough that it's not really going to jiggle, but you don't want it to wrench it down so tight that it's too compressed and it won't be able to seal. So I'm going to take my jar lifter and use it to put my jar into the canner. And why I'm using this is because I already have about 2.5, 3 inches of water in the bottom of my canner, and I've already had it on medium low, so my water is starting to heat up. You don't want it to be too hot because with doing a raw pack, your meat is pretty cold because I just took it out of the refrigerator. And while I did pre-warm my jars before adding the meat, it does cool it enough that if I put it into really hot water, it could have temperature shock and my glass could break. So when you are getting ready to can, you can have your water starting to warm up about 140 degrees for cold pack or raw pack, and about 180 degrees for hot pack. So now I am going to continue filling the rest of our jars. And then after I've done that, I'll show you how to put the lid on and get started. All right, now that I have put my chicken into my other jars, it's time to put our lid on our canner and get started. So today we're using a Presto pressure gauge canner. And sometimes putting the lids on can be a little tricky. With this one, luckily it has a little V right here that you match up with the V or the arrow on the handle. And then once you have that on there, you just want to turn it slightly. And it is going to be a little hard to turn. And that rubber gasket is what makes it a little hard to turn because it wants to be tight fitting so that air can't escape. So now that our lid is on, we are going to turn up the heat to high on our canner. And then we're going to be keeping an eye on it and watching it. Once it starts to boil and steam, we're going to see steam coming out of the vent right here. And once we have a good amount of steam, about pencil thick or pinky thick, then we're going to set a timer for 10 minutes and vent our canner. While we're waiting for that to happen, I am going to switch over to my PowerPoint and we are going to go over some important things that I want you to know. Also, I would like you to know that our recipe today that we're using for canning our poultry comes from the Complete Guide to Home Canning put out by the USDA. This is a publication that you can purchase online from Penn State, or you can download it as just one large PDF or multiple small ones online for free. So if you just want to have the information, you can download it for free or buy it. I like to have it handy just so I can easily refer to it. So in here, the one really nice thing about it is that it talks about canning chicken or rabbit. So you could do either chicken or rabbit using this recipe, or pork, sometimes turkey or other similar types of poultry. So we have a dial gauge canner. So we will need to use 12 pounds of pressure when it's time, and I'll show you what that looks like. And because we are doing pints, once it's up to pressure, we're going to process it for 75 minutes. If we were doing quarts, it would be 90. And this is because we're doing boneless chicken. If we were going to be doing chicken with bones, it'd be a little different. And our time would be 65 minutes for pints and 75 minutes for quarts. Also be aware that if you're using a weighted gauge canner, you would be using 15 pounds of pressure. And one really nice thing about this USDA book is that it gives you options for both. And then it also shows you easily what your pressure should be depending on your elevation, so you don't have to make those calculations yourself.
All right, well, we are waiting for our canner to be getting to the point that we can start timing it for venting. We will talk over this PowerPoint. So our job as Extension Family and Consumer Sciences educators is to teach safe food preservation practices in order to reduce foodborne illnesses and healthcare costs. So that's the whole reason why we teach classes and offer the different programs that we do. As I mentioned, the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning is a great resource to get up-to-date and safe recommendations for canning. You can also go to the National Center for Home Food Preservation. That has a really great search bar where you can type in what it is you're wanting to preserve, and it will give you some great recipes. Or you can also do Ball Blue Book at their website, freshpreserving.com. They have a variety of recipes. So you might wonder, why would I want to can meat or poultry? One of the biggest reasons is that people want to save freezer space and also save money because they're not using that electricity to keep their freezer going. Another great reason to have canned meat is it's a really quick meal because it's already thawed and it's fully cooked. So all you have to do is open your jar, add it to whatever it is you're cooking, warm it up, and it's ready to go. So if you haven't done any type of food preservation such as canning before, it can be a little expensive to get started. And then also, one of the big disadvantages is it is very time and labor intensive. You're not going to can when you just have a spare half an hour. Usually it takes several hours, if not most of a day, depending on what it is you're wanting to preserve. However, there are some great advantages, and this is the main reason that most people do choose to preserve their food at home. It's really nice that you can control exactly what is going into your family's diet. It allows you to know where your food comes from because either you grew it or you purchased it locally. And always there's a great personal satisfaction when you see all of those jars that you canned, whether they're cooling on your counter or they're on the shelf in your pantry or your basement or wherever it is you're storing them. You just get such a great feeling of pride knowing that you've put away that food for your family. And then also, for those of you that have canned before, as your jars seal, there's that little ping that they make. And quite personally, I think that's one of the greatest sounds in the world. As with any type of food preservation, there are some different factors that are going to affect the nutrition of your home canned foods. And these include the condition of your produce or product when it was harvested, how you store it, and also the length of storage before processing, your methods used, and then your produce variety can also make a difference. So if you're doing some fruits and vegetables, there's going to be some vitamin lost from those heat-sensitive vitamins that can't be avoided. However, your minerals, fats, carbohydrates, and proteins are going to be relatively stable. And those are what are most important in our canned meats. All right, I'm going to pause this and we're going to move back to the camera for a minute because I believe our canner is ready for us to set the timer for venting. All right, so as you can see now, our steam is coming out of our canner very consistently. It's pretty coming out really thick. So I'm going to set the timer. I'm just going to use the timer on my phone and set it for 10 minutes. However, you can use a kitchen timer or whatever type of timer you have. But most of us have a timer on our phone right next to us, so sometimes that's the easiest. One thing to know is that as your canner is venting, if a lot of water starts coming out the top, then you can turn it down a little. You don't want to turn it down so much that it stops, consistently venting. But you want to let all this steam come out and get that extra air out of your canner so that it can come up to pressure and hit that high, 240 degrees or above needed to kill potential botulism. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Also, once this has come up to its 10 minutes, then we are going to put on the weight. So in case you're wondering what it is that determines whether you're going to be water bath canning or pressure canning something, the biggest factor is the acidity level. So we're going to be doing water bath canning with high acid foods. So those are going to be our foods with a pH of 4.6 or lower. So you remember the higher the number, the more acidic that food is going to be. So that's why we can pressure or water bath a lot of our fruits and jams and jellies and things like that. And then pressure canning is for our low acid foods. So that's why with our meats, poultries, vegetables, mixed products, their pH levels are low enough that we need to use that pressure canning. So our boiling water canner is going to hit temperatures of 212 degrees at sea level. So this is used for fruits, acidified tomato products, so always add acid to those tomatoes, soft spreads, juices, pickled products, anything along those lines. However, our pressure canner can reach a much higher temperature, and it's going to hit about 240 degrees at 10 pounds of pressure at sea level. This is required for all low acid foods, including meat, fish, poultry, vegetables, and other mixed foods. To make sure that you're going to have safe, quality canned meat and poultry, you need to check your dial gauge on your pressure canner every year. I just checked the dial on this canner a few weeks ago, so I know we're good to go. Why you want to check that is because it can change over time, especially if you've recently moved or it was dropped or something else. Even if you buy a brand new canner, you want to still get it tested, because with shipping and other things, the gauges on a brand new canner can still be off significantly. So take them into your local extension office or other local canner testing source. Always use only good quality poultry, red meat, and game. If you start out with an inferior product, what you have in the end is also going to be not the high quality that you would prefer. If you are slaughtering the animal yourself, make sure that it is chilled to 40 degrees or lower as soon as possible. And then you want to can it within a few days, or you can freeze it for future use. If you do decide to freeze it and can it later, you need to make sure you defrost it in your refrigerator before canning. Keep your work areas sanitary and the meat clean. I did sanitize my surfaces before starting our canning today. You want to trim off any gristle, bruise spots, and fat before canning. Extra fat in your jar could cause your product to go rancid. Make sure that you vent your pressure canner for 10 minutes before starting, and that's what we're doing right now. And avoid combinations without tested recipes. So always make sure you're using a recipe that has been research-based, whether that be from an extension service, USDA, Ball, or anywhere similar. You really want to beware of Pinterest and YouTube or online blogs. There's a lot of misinformation out there regarding canning. You want to keep your fresh meat, wild game, poultry, or fish refrigerated at 40 degrees or colder. And like I said earlier, store it for no more than 2 days before canning it. You want to wash your hands well before and after handling raw meat, wild game, poultry, and fish, and scrub your hands vigorously for 20 seconds while washing. Also, sanitizing your hands after washing is a pretty good idea. You want to wash your cutting boards and knives, as well as your equipment and other kitchen surfaces with warm soapy water after cutting up your raw meat. You want to rinse your clean items with warm water, then sanitize with a diluted bleach solution. And this is 1 teaspoon of bleach in 1 quart of water. When you're canning meat and other products, you want to be aware of different pathogens of concern. One you may have heard of quite a bit is E. coli 0157H7, Listeria. Salmonella is one that we're really concerned with in poultry. Clostridium botulinum, and that's for all low acid foods. And then various parasites that we're more concerned about if you are canning wild game. So the biggest food safety risk in home canning low acid foods is Clostridium botulinum, and that's the bacteria that causes botulism. It's found in the environment in spore form. High temperatures can destroy the spores, so that's 240 to 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Undestroyed spores form a toxin in a low oxygen environment, and a low oxygen environment is your sealed canning jar. Other similar things too, but that's why we're so concerned, is that you're creating the perfect environment when you're canning a low acid food. The toxin produced by this bacteria is deadly, and as little as 6 to 10 cells can make you ill. So those ideal growing conditions for botulism is a moist low acid food. So that's any of your low acid foods you're going to be canning at home. And between 40 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. So again, that's that temperature range we're going to be storing our jars. And then because there is no air in the jar, that bacteria can survive. And then your spores will germinate and produce a toxin, thus causing botulism. Unfortunately, foods that have the botulism toxin show no signs. There's no color changes, no odor changes. And if you have eaten something that is going to cause botulism, your symptoms are usually going to appear within 12 to 72 hours. These symptoms include digestive upset in some cases, blurred or double vision, difficulty swallowing, speaking, or breathing, paralysis, and then eventually, if you're not treated and given the antitoxin, botulism can cause death. All right, so we are going to do the steps in the canning process in just a minute. Our timer is about to go off for venting.
All right, now that our timer has gone off and we have vented our canner for a full 10 minutes, I'm going to take my weight and put it on top of the vent. This will allow now for the steam to stop escaping, and it will build up the pressure in our canner. So it takes a little while, but once steam gets built up significantly, then this is going to pop up a little bit. And that is one built-in safety feature this canner has, because once that has popped up, you're not able to take the lid off and cause any accidents that way. And then after a few more minutes, our dial gauge is going to start going up. And when it gets up to 12 pounds of pressure, then we can set our timer for that 75 minutes to make sure that our poultry is fully processed, and then we'll be safe to store and eat at a later date.
All right, now we're going to talk about the steps in the canning process. And most of these should sound pretty familiar because they're things we already did or talked about in the beginning of our class. All right, when you are getting ready to can, you want to prepare your jars. You want to make sure that they are clean and warm. You only need to sterilize them if you're going to be processing it for less than 10 minutes. So really, this is only going to be things that you're water bathing, such as small jars of jams or jellies. Most everything else you're going to can is have a longer processing time. So it doesn't have to be sterile, just clean and warm. And then prepare your lid as per your manufacturer's instructions. As I mentioned before, our lids just needed to be washed and set aside. They don't need to be simmered. Most don't anymore. Always make sure that you are using canning jars. While there are other jars out there that might be the correct size, they are not manufactured the same as canning jars, and therefore they might not be able to withstand the heat and pressure that you are going to be using when you're canning. Using a canning funnel makes it really nice. It cuts down on mess. And also if you have a funnel like what I showed you, then it has its headspace built in. If you have a traditional canning funnel without that extra headspace, then you can use a headspace tool or just a ruler to check and make sure you're not going over that headspace. Any approved recipe that you use is going to tell you what size of jar you should be utilizing. So for most things, such as meats or starchy vegetables or starchy combinations, it's going to give you pints, although sometimes it will give you recipes and times for quarts as well. And there are half-gallon jars out there, but those are only approved for juices. You can't can anything else but a juice in those larger jars. Then you want to pack your jar, either hot or raw, according to the directions. Today we did our poultry using raw pack, although you could do a hot pack poultry as well. Always avoid overfilling. If you don't allow enough headspace, it can cause problems with your jar. If you're doing something with liquid, you want to release air bubbles with a plastic spatula or something similar, as you can see in this picture. Clean the top edges of your jar to remove any food particles. And again, leave that proper headspace. This shows you kind of an estimation of where the headspace is on your jar. So some recipes do call for as little as a 1/4 inch headspace, and that's a lot of your jams and jellies and things such as that. Some other recipes have a 1/2 inch or a 1 inch. And the amount needed just depends on your food and pack style, but your recipe will tell you exactly how much headspace is needed. Most meats, like what we're doing today, are going to require 1 inch of headspace. When you're doing raw pack, you place your food in your jar, and unless it's something with a meat that's going to produce its own juice, then you're going to cover it in boiling water, or you're boiling juices or liquid used from cooking that item. One disadvantage is that you usually get a little bit less food in the jar. However, it does save quite a bit on preparation time. A hot pack is when your food is heated briefly, and that helps remove the air and make it easier to pack. Fortunately, you're able to fit more food in the jar. And then also, it can be a step that's going to further cleanse your food because your blanching water for vegetables are going to be discarded and you're going to use fresh water when you're packaging. Your processing times are going to depend quite a bit on the style of food being canned. It's also going to depend on hot or raw pack. The majority of the time, you're going to have a different processing time if you're doing a raw versus hot. The thickness of the food being canned, the size of the jar, so the larger your jar, the longer your time, and then also altitude is going to make a difference. When using a pressure canner, you want to add 2 to 3 inches of hot water. Sometimes you can add a little more, especially if you're doing something that takes a long time. Meat and poultry have pretty long times, although fish has the longest processing times. Once you have your jars filled, you place them on your rack, so that metal rack at the bottom of your canner. Fasten your lid securely and then leave the weight off of your vent port. To vent your canner, as we did earlier, you want to maintain high heat and exhaust it for 10 minutes. You should see or feel that pencil-sized stream of air coming out. And then you want to make sure that you're not venting with water coming out, so you can turn it down a little to medium high if you do have large drops of water coming out. Once you've hit that 10 minutes, either add your weight or close your petcock, depending on type of canner, and your canner will begin to pressurize in 3 to 5 minutes. And then the timing process is what you are going to start once your dial gauge has reached the recommended pressure. Our canner is still currently getting up to that point, so we can't set our timer yet. Or if you have a weighted gauge, it will begin to jiggle or rock. So you need to check your manufacturer's instructions to see how often it needs to be jiggling so you know when to start your timer. Once you've hit that desired level of pressure, you want to regulate the heat under your canner. So you need to maintain that steady pressure, either at or slightly above the correct pressure. Read your manufacturer's instructions for any tips on using your canner. And you also don't want to be having a big heat fluctuation. If your temperature is really going up and down, it can cause liquid loss, and that's going to result in some oxidation and color and flavor changes in your jar. Also, you want to make sure that your pressure never goes below that desired time once you have set the timer. So for example, once our canner gets up to 12 pounds and we've set that timer, if it drops below that 12 pounds, then we need to stop our timer, get the canner back up to 12 pounds, and then restart the process all over again at our 75 minutes. So that's why it's so important to make sure that the pressure is maintained the whole time during the canning process. You need to be aware of altitude adjustments because, as you know, water boils at lower temperatures as your altitude increases. And these lower temperatures mean that they're less effective at killing potential bacteria that might be in your jar. So in order to kill these bacteria, we either increase the processing time of a water bath canner, or we increase the pressure to compensate for these boiling temperatures. So make sure that you are following the correct processing times and pressure for your specific altitude. So this altitude shows that where I am here in Bonners Ferry, we're right about 2,000 feet. Some of us are a little above, some of us are a little below. So I recommend that people use at least that 2,000 feet and above when they are figuring out their altitude for their canning to make sure that they are being safe. All right, I know with the camera having to be farther away, it's kind of hard to see, but our dial gauge has now come up to 12 pounds of pressure.
So I don't want it to go way past that. So I have turned my stove down to about medium. And I'm going to keep an eye on that to make sure that it's not continuing to go up too far, and that it kind of regulates out. Also, I'm grabbing my phone and I'm setting that 75-minute timer, and then I'll be watching it pretty consistently and monitoring it while we continue the rest of our presentation.
All right, now we are going to be talking about the cooling process. So this is what we need to be thinking about for once our canner has processed at that 12 pounds of pressure for the 75 minutes. So once your timer goes off, you want to turn off your heat source. If you are strong enough to gently lift your canner and move it off of that burner, then that will help it cool down faster. But if you are you're not concerned about being strong enough, or you're worried about safety, it's fine. Just leave it there. It can just take a little longer to cool down, and that's not a problem. Always, you want to let your canner cool down naturally and lose pressure on its own before attempting to open it. Don't hurry the cooling process. This is one time in your canning process that you can kind of walk away a little bit and do other things you might need to do. If you try to force the cooling of your canner, whether that be by putting it under cold water, sticking it in a snowbank, doing anything else like that, that can cause under processing of your foods. It can warp your canner lid, it can cause your jars to lose liquid, it can cause all sorts of problems. So when your canner is cooling down, that is one thing that you just can't hurry, and you just need to let it take its own time. So after the pressure on your canner has reached 0 pounds of pressure, then you want to give it 10 more minutes. And then unfasten your lid and carefully remove it. Make sure that you're lifting it away from your face so that you're avoiding steam burns. Then take out your jars with a jar lifter, and I'll be showing you how to do this once our canner is all done processing. Place your jars on a towel or a cooling rack using the 2-finger rule. So that means leave at least 2 fingers width of space in between your jars so that air can adequately circulate and cool your jars consistently. Let them sit there for 12 to 24 hours before you check for the seal. To test for a good seal, you want to press the middle of your lid. It should not spring up. Tap the lid with a spoon. If it sounds dull, it may not be sealed. Or once it's cooled all the way, you can hold it at eye level and look for the lid to be concave. Another thing you can do is if you are close to your jars while they are cooling down, you can listen for the little pings and you can count how many of those there are. But even when you're counting, you still want to go around and push the middle of your lids once they've cooled down to double check and make sure everything has adequately sealed. There are some different reasons that your jars might fail to seal, and this can include either old or reused lids. You don't want to buy more lids than you're going to use within the next 2 to 3 years because that rubber compound can go bad and change over time. Definitely don't reuse lids you've already canned with before because that compound isn't the same as your brand new lid. Check for damage on the rim of your jar. So just run your finger along the top and make sure there's no little dents or chips in it. It might fail to seal because of improper processing. So make sure you're always using the correct time and the correct method of canning for your food. Also, if there's food particles on the rim because you forgot to wipe the rim. So make sure that you do that before putting the lid on, and also use the correct torque and make sure you're not putting your band on too tight before placing your jar in your canner. If you have jars that didn't seal right away, or they've cooled down and you've checked them a few hours later and they haven't sealed, you can reprocess them. Or if something happened to your food and you were able to complete the processing time, then you could reprocess them. However, you do need to reheat your food, wash your jars, and get new lids before you reprocess them. You can't use the same lid. However, if you've done a batch and only 1 or 2 jars have sealed or have not sealed, it's really not worth the effort most of the time to reprocess them. So you just take those jars and you can put them in your refrigerator and use within a few days, or put it in your freezer for later use. Just make sure that you take enough out of the top that as that food expands, it's not going to expand so much that it causes your jar to break. When you're storing home canned foods, you want to make sure that you take off the bands or rings. Wipe off your lids and jars, especially because sometimes they can get a little bit of seepage outside of the jar from the food. And as long as it's still sealed, it's still going to be safe if you followed all the proper procedures. Rinse and dry your jars. And don't put the bands and rings back on. You need to leave them off. And then label your jar. You need to put the date so that you know you're using it within that 12 to 18 months after you canned it. And then also, if it's a product that's going to look very similar to other things, for example, different types of meats or jams or jellies, you might not be able to tell the difference. So if it is something that's going to look very similar to other things you have, you can put the product name on top. Your ideal storage temperature is going to be about 50 to 70 degrees. So this is going to be the temperature of your pantry or storeroom or somewhere in your home that you store your foods. It's best if you can have them in a dark environment because the light seeping in through your jars can hasten the oxidation, and light can destroy certain vitamins. It's also important to rotate your home canned foods. So for example, if you canned green beans last year and you still have a few jars left, you want to put those in the front and put your newer jars in the back. That way you're using up your older product first and not having jars in the back of your cupboard that you forget about. And when you find them several years later, they're not safe to eat. So when you choose your canner, you want to make sure that you're choosing one that works for you and using and caring for it properly. So before you go purchase a canner, you want to determine what type of canning you're going to be doing. If you're going to be doing fruits, soft spreads, or acidified products, then a water bath canner is all you need. However, if you're wanting to do meat, poultry, fish, seafood, or vegetables, then you're going to need to purchase a pressure canner. There are a lot of different places that you can buy canners. You can find them at hardware stores, variety stores. If you want to get them a little cheaper, you can find them at secondhand stores, yard sales, estate sales. However, if you do purchase them secondhand, I would encourage you to take it in to a local extension office so they can look at it with you and make sure that everything is there that it needs and that it's going to function well. Or you can borrow it from family or friends. There's 2 types of pressure canners. There's a dial gauge like we're using today, or there's weighted gauges. And you can see in the picture here, there's a couple different types of weighted gauges out there. They all function the same. The circle one has it so that you just turn it, and depending on how you place it on the vent, it's going to give you that 5, 10, or 15 pounds of pressure. The other canner is a type of canner that has different weights. And so you have a different weight for your 5, your 10, and your 15. So you just need to make sure that you are aware of which weight corresponds with which pounds of pressure and that you're not using the wrong one. There are some great advantages to a weighted gauge. Is it controls the pressure precisely. You don't have to be making sure that the needle's right at a certain place. It emits tiny amounts of air and steam while it is doing the canner process. While I still don't recommend that you leave the kitchen or leave your house, it doesn't need quite the constant watching that a dial gauge does because you don't have a needle that you're really paying close to. One of the greatest advantages to a weighted gauge is that it stays calibrated. You don't have to take it in every year to get tested as you do with a dial. But the one big disadvantage is you can't correct for higher altitudes to a specific pound. So you can't process things at 11 or 12 or 13 pounds. It automatically has to be at that 15 pounds. So some of your things might be processed a little more than they would if you were using a dial gauge. So a dial gauge canner, like what we're doing today, has its greatest advantage in the fact that you are able to adjust your altitude to that exact pound of pressure. One of the bigger disadvantages is that you do need to check it every year and make sure that the gauge is within 2 pounds. If it is within 2 pounds, then you just need to adjust your pressure accordingly. However, if it's off by more than those 2 pounds, you do need to buy a new gauge. However, most gauges you can replace for somewhere between $15 to $20. Some brands are a little more, and it also can depend on where you purchase it. And then your dial gauge does need that more constant monitoring to make sure that your dial isn't moving around. These are the pressure gauge parts. Several of them we've already talked about. You've got your gauge on top, and then your one-piece regulator, the little weight that we put on it, and the vent pipe is where we saw the steam come out. It has a safety valve so that if it can keep the pressure, once the pressure comes up, it keeps your jar from, or your canner from opening. There's also the overpressure plug that's going to be a little black piece of rubber that is designed to blow out of the canner if it gets too high of pressure, so that your canner itself doesn't blow up or cause an accident. There's the lid, the large base of your canner. You always want to have that metal rack on the bottom, and then that gasket that goes around your lid. Although there are some types of pressure canners that are straight metal to metal and don't have a gasket. So the safety features, some of these we've already talked about. It has a vent port, and it controls the escape of the air. Our safety plug or overpressure plug is what will release if your temperature or your pressure becomes too high in your canner, like if something happened and you weren't able to watch your canner appropriately, like if there was an emergency or something else, then that safety plug would blow out of the canner, thus releasing the pressure instead of your canner exploding and having the lid go everywhere. And you've seen probably pictures of horrendous things happening, but that safety plug is designed to prevent that. You always want to have that metal rack on the bottom of your canner because that direct heat on your jars could cause them to break. Also, check your canner. On the bottom, it should have a UL seal signaling Underwriters Laboratories that shows that your canner was manufactured by a reputable company that has good manufacturing processes. You always want to take good care of your canner. You want to wash it with soapy water and rinse and dry it every time you use it. If it does get some hard water stains or different things in it, you don't want to use sodium hydroxide, lye, scouring powder, or baking soda, as that can corrode the inside of your canner. You can remove hard water stains using vinegar if you would like, but a hard water stain isn't going to hurt or cause anything for food safety. Also, if you do have really hard water, one trick you can do is in your canning water, add just a little bit of white vinegar, and that will make it so that those minerals that cause that dusty white film on your jars and in your canner, that will neutralize them. So just using that little bit of vinegar in your canning water can make a huge difference. Also, never leave water or food in your canner long term. So once your canner is done processing and you can take those jars, as soon as it has cooled enough that you can dispose of that water, you need to do so and clean your canner. Leaving it in there for long periods of time can really do lots of damage. You always want to care for your canner lid properly, so read and follow your manufacturer's directions. Make sure that you're thoroughly cleaning the edges and other parts. Don't immerse your canner lid in water, especially if it has a dial gauge, as that could ruin it. If you have an older canner, some of them recommend you do not tip your lid upside down during storage. So again, check with your manufacturer and see if that applies to the canner you're using. If there are tiny steam leaks that aren't interfering with processing, that's okay. However, if you see some larger steam leaks, you quite often need to check your gasket and might even need to replace it. Always handle your gaskets very carefully. You want to also clean them well, so wash them in warm soapy water and let them dry between every time you use your canner, and then check it. Over time, they can become nicked or dried or gummy, and you'll need to get a new one. Always check every part of your canner. So this includes your metal base and other things like that, and make sure it's clean. Wash and dry any removable petcocks. Sometimes you might need to soak them in vinegar, especially if you have hard water buildup. And then if you might need to use a pipe cleaner or a string to clean out the inside of that petcock that you can't reach, especially if it's attached to your lid. When storing your pressure canner, you want to make sure it's clean and completely dry before you put it away for storage. You want air to be able to reach the inside of your canner. So I always take big brown pieces of like kind of packing paper, and I crumple that up inside my canner and then have some of it sticking out the sides so that air can still get in and out of the canner. And then also that crumpled up paper will absorb any moisture that could possibly get into your canner. And then if your canner lid does need to be placed right side up, then make sure it's, on a shelf or not completely enclosing your canner where no air can get inside. If your canner does need replacement parts, you can usually find them at stores that are selling canning supplies. Sometimes you might need to order them, and you can do this over the phone or online, but you need to make sure that you first know the brand of your canner and then also know the model number of your canner, because even if you know the brand, sometimes there are different parts for different models, even within the same company. There are some potentially deadly errors when it comes to canning that I want you to be aware of. So please never do these things. So never make up a recipe. You need to leave this to the universities and USDA and Ball, because they have trained scientists and they have labs and they can test all these recipes they're creating and making sure they're safe. Never add extra starch to a recipe. If you want it to be thicker, then you can thicken it after you open the jar and use it for your food product. Don't add extra vegetables to salsa, because then you're changing the pH level and could be turning your high acid food into potentially low acid food. Never can using an oven or an electric pressure cooker. And don't forget to make altitude adjustments. Not having that extra time or pressure can cause your product to be under processed, thus leading to potential foodborne illness. Some other potentially deadly errors when it comes to canning includes not venting your canner. So always venting it for that 10 minutes is very important. Not having your gauge tested annually, because if you don't test it, you might have enough pressure off than what you think it is that your food is being under processed. Don't fail to acidify any tomatoes you're going to can. You always need to add that extra acid, whether it be citric acid, bottled lemon juice, or vinegar. Never force cool a pressure canner, because that can also lead to under processed food. Also, you don't want to let your food cool before processing. So if you are making a recipe and you have it hot, you want to get it in your jars and process it right away. If for some reason your food that you're going to can cools down before you have a chance to put it in your jar, you need to reheat it, because these recipes are designed to have a food that's already at a certain temperature before putting it in your canner for processing. Failing to vent your canner can have major consequences. It can reduce your food sterilization and microbial kill by as much as 48%. So that's why this is such an important step. Sometimes you might be wondering, is a canned food safe to eat? And whether that is something you canned or something you received from a friend, you want to ask these questions. So was it canned by up-to-date instructions using a reliable source, and were directions followed explicitly? Check, is the jar sealed? If it's not sealed right there, that should tell you it's not safe. Also, are there no obvious signs of spoilage? If you can answer all of these questions correctly, then you should feel okay about eating this product. If current recommendations have been followed explicitly and all critical control points have been taken, then boiling it before use isn't necessary. However, if you want to be extra safe, you can boil it for 10 minutes, and for very thick foods, boil for 20 minutes. However, if you really have any concerns at all, I would encourage you to dispose of it and not even take the risk of eating it. If you do have a jar that you're concerned about and that jar is still sealed, then to dispose of it properly, you want to write danger, poison, do not eat on that jar. And then place the jars in a heavyweight garbage bag, close them, and place them in the trash where no one else can get them. However, if your jars are unsealed, open, or leaking, then you want to remove the lids, place your jars on their side in a large pot, and add water until there's about 1 inch of water above your jars. Boil thoroughly for 30 minutes to detoxify the food, and then cool down the contents of your pot and discard the food and the lids. Wash your jars in your pot and sanitize them and all surfaces with a chlorine solution. There are some great resources out there besides what I talked about for preserving meat. There's P&W 361, that's canning meat, poultry, and game. P&W 517, big game from hunt to home. And we have a new publication that is recently, well, it's an older publication, but it's just recently been updated. It's P&W 632, making jerky at home safely. And these are all available from the University of Idaho website. So as you can see here on this slide, I have where you can go to find a variety of publications from the University of Idaho for food safety. Also, you can just Google University of Idaho food safety publications, and that site should pop up and you can see the list. All of our publications are available to download for free. Again, the National Center for Home Food Preservation is a great resource. If you would like to, we have our Preserve at Home course offered by the University of Idaho Extension. It is a 6-week online course. We offer it twice a year, once in January and once in June. And it's $35 to take it. If you're interested in that course, I'm one of the instructors and you can contact me and I can help you get in contact with the person you need to sign up with. So thank you so much for listening to this. I will still show you in a little bit, once our canner is done processing, how to take out your jars and cool them properly. But if you have any questions about food preservation or food safety, feel free to contact me. As I mentioned before, I'm in Boundary County, so I'm in Bonners Ferry. You can easily get a hold of me at my email, which is amrobertson@uidaho.edu, or you can call me at 208-267-3235. We'll be back in just a little bit once we can take our jars out of the canner.
All right, so our chicken processed for 75 minutes at 12 pounds of pressure, and then I turned it off and let it cool down. It actually took about 45 minutes for the canner to cool completely. So I waited until it came down to 0, and then also this little button right here in the front, right here, popped down. And so once that popped down, I was able to take off this weight and then take off the lid, and I took it off facing away from me so I wouldn't get steam burns on me. I put a towel down right here for my jars, because if I put it on a cold counter, that thermal shock could cause my jars to break. Or also, depending on what type of counter you have, it could cause damage. So you always want to use a jar lifter and make sure you're using this part at the top, and this rubbery kind of curved part is there to grip the jar. So you want to reach in and grasp it firmly and pull it straight up. You don't want to tip it, even if there's water on top, you want to just leave it alone and not tip it at all. So as you can see, it's still kind of bubbling because it's still really hot, and that is perfectly normal. I'll talk about one more jar just to show you how far apart we want to space them. So as you can see, I have about 2 fingers width or a little more space in between my jars. That way there's lots of room for the air to circulate and my jars can cool down evenly and not have any parts that are having a hard time cooling down because they're too close together. So now I'm going to leave my jars here. I'll take the other ones out in just a minute, and I'm going to leave them here, and I'm not going to touch them for at least 12 hours. Once they've cooled down sufficiently, I will check them by pushing the top to see if they seal. While they're still hot, you don't want to touch the top because that could mess with the true seal. And then, like we talked about in our earlier part of the video, once I am done, I'm going to take off the bands. I will wash these, label them, put today's date. Also, I will put chicken on the lid so I know what it is. And that's all. So if you have any questions, you have my contact information in that one slide earlier. Also, you can always just contact the Boundary County Extension Office at 208-267-3235. Thank you so much and happy canning.